given and we'll continue. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, then we're going to start. Since we have a timekeeper, we have judges, we have debaters, we don't really need anything else. I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case for the opening government proceedings.
We see in the United States how 1% of the population is dominating 50% of our wealth. We see how when some people earn $100 an hour, we see some people are just receiving just the minimum wage. We see how some people don't have access to medicine, where some people have loads of medicine. We think social inequality has come too far. We think humans' never-ending thirst for economic growth and their own greed is actually harming our society in many various levels. We're going to say that today's debate takes place in basically all economies, but we're going to exclude the economies that are in dire situation. Countries like Sub-Saharan Africa, where people are starving, where there is death prevalent. We think in those countries, there isn't much inequality. We think in those countries, people are basically all poor. That's why we're actually going to exclude those areas, Mr. Speaker. We have three substantives to prove to you in my speech. Number one, I'm going to prove to you why only going for economic growth and only prioritizing economic growth actually harms the economic growth to begin with. Secondly, I'm going to further deepen that argument and tell you why social inequality dealing with social inequality should actually be prioritized. And thirdly, I'm going to tell you why we guarantee actually better happiness for people. No, thank you. So going on time for, actually, yes, I'll take it.
Perhaps can you elaborate on some of these social policies that overcome and reduce social inequality?
Right. We think the measures to deal with social inequality deals with many measures, including school education provided to the people, welfare programs provided to the people. We think it's basic, simple, right? We think it's easy to understand. So let's go on to our first argumentation, why only going for economic growth will actually only harm the economic growth to begin with. So, Mr. Speaker, although we actually prioritize redistribution and dealing with social inequality at the cost of growth, we don't think this necessarily means that we're not going to have inequality. We don't think this necessarily means that we're not going to have economic growth at all. We think, no, thank you. We think number one, through providing social measures to actually deal with social inequality, we think through measures like education, redistribution, and welfare, we think number one, it actually increases the number of viable consumers within our society, right? We think just because you go for economic growth doesn't mean everyone in our society becomes rich, right? We think if only the companies develop and only the rich on the top population of our top people in our society develop, and people in the bottom situations just remain the same and remain poor, we think the number of consumers that can actually help the growth and further development of our companies will actually be reduced, which is actually a harm to the economic growth, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what happened in the United States in the past, where we actually had recession, right? We actually saw how even if we had more support, more production, and increased productivity level, we saw decreased consumption and therefore leading to economic recession, thereby harming the economic growth of our society. No, thank you. That's why by actually going for redistributive measures and increasing the number of viable consumers within the society, we want to actually help the economic growth, Mr. Speaker. No, thank you. But secondly, we want to actually increase the number of productive members within the society. We think if you don't deal with social inequality to begin with, and if you actually leave people to be unproductive because they don't have access to medicine, because they're actually starving and whatnot, we think this actually reduces the number of people that can actually have productive return to our society, that can actually contribute to our society for economic growth. We want to actually reduce that and actually provide education to the people so that we have more talented people within the society, so that we can contribute to society and actually contribute to economic growth that we want in our society, Mr. Speaker. That's what I think what we saw in Finland, right? We did see redistribution taking place, but Finland actually did develop into a good economy, no thank you. And that's what we even saw in the United Kingdom, where their actually health system actually worked perfectly fine. Those are the countries that we actually want, and we think we can actually achieve that by prioritizing economic and social inequality, Mr. Speaker. No thank you. But furthermore, we think not gender inequality actually harms it, because it harms economic growth to begin with, because it leads on to further social fraction. We think you cultivate a culture where different classes or different parties reflecting different interests and different ideologies actually refuse to cooperate with another and refuse to actually talk to one another and compromise with another, right? We think, for example, in political parties, when they have to reflect different interests, no thank you, we think they do actually need to compromise at some point in order to have a more fruitful discussion. But when you actually have highest level of social inequality, we think these parties become radicalized, and therefore it leads on to less fruitful discussions taking place between parties, leading on to less functional development at the end of the day, leading on to harm for our economic growth to begin with, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, even if they want economic growth, only prioritizing economic growth, we think, will actually harm economic growth and actually harm economic growth, and that's why we actually do need to cater social inequality. But secondly, let's go into deeply why we actually do need to prioritize social inequality more. No, thank you. We think we need to prioritize catering social inequality, because if you simply go for economic growth and simply prioritize economic growth, we think it's impossible to go for redistribution at the end of the day. Why is that so? Because number one, Mr. Speaker, by prioritizing economic growth, we think it necessarily means that you're going to be prioritizing certain sectors, certain fields, and certain regions, right? We think that kind of economic growth translates into more political power for these sectors, meaning that these people will have the lack of willingness to actually go for redistribution to begin with. No, thank you. That's why it's actually impossible for us to move on to new level of redistribution if you just simply go for economic growth. But secondly, we think there's a never-ending thirst and a never-ending greed, and that's actually going to be embedded within our culture. What do we mean by this? We always say that we need to have economic growth, that we need to prioritize economic growth to actually make our cups and make our pies bigger, right? But once we do reach that cup and once we do reach that pie, we enlarge that pie and we enlarge that cup to actually have more economic growth. Meaning that humans' greed for economic growth and economic development is never ending, and when we're actually not political capital to actually put an end to this, Mr. Speaker. That's why we actually do need a culture cultivated to actually go for social redistribution to begin with. But lastly, going on to the third argumentation about happiness for the people. We think the primary role of the government is to actually cater the happiness for the people, right? But we think simply going for economic growth actually reduces the happiness for the people, because our happiness is usually determined through our comparison to other people, right? We think high level of social inequality leads to a feeling of relative deprivation for you, right? Because even if you want to feel satisfied with what you have, you see other people having more, you see other people earning more at an easier cost. That's why, even if you want to be satisfied, you see that you feel like what you have isn't enough, that you need to have more, that you are at the bottom of the population. That's why it also leads on to less happiness for these people, which is actually going against the primary and the most fundamental role of the government that they should be serving. And this actually leads on to another vicious cycle, where it leads on to social fraction of our society at the end of the day. So, Mr. Speaker, if you want economic growth, you still need to cater social inequality. If you want functional government, you still need to cater inequality. If you actually want happiness for the people, you still need to cater inequality, and for all those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Okay, we thank that lady for her speech, and now I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Just because you bridge the gap doesn't mean that the poor automatically becomes better off. On side opposition, we believe that the growth must come first. And when we have that growth, that's when everybody will prosper, and we think that we're able to do the kind of things that they care about, such as, for example, providing welfare, such as educating people and training people so they can have better jobs. The stance for side opposition is that we have some form of social safety net, and this will be empowered by economic growth in true Singapore style. So we have things like pension schemes, whereby the government will put in bonuses when the country earns a lot of dividends from the kind of taxation we get from the government, from the companies. We'll be happy to use this money that we get from the economic growth and redirect that to training of individuals, and we're also happy to have things like, for example, workplace safety laws to ensure that people work in good environments rather than just bend over to the corporate overlords, right? In my speech, I'll answer two big questions. Firstly, why do policies that seek to reduce income inequality often worsen the problem? And secondly, why do we think economic growth policies are effective and important and much better in helping the poor, the very people that they care about? So, firstly, some remarks. They argue that somehow, when there are enough poor people, they will start to radicalize. But before that is,
look, when you enlarge the pie, it doesn't mean that you get a larger percentage of the pie. Most of the time, large corporations engulf smaller corporations and smaller individuals to take a larger portion.
Ultimately, what we say is that if that means that these bigger corporations want to stay in the long run and hire more people, we think that that's fine. But what we argue, members of this house, is that eventually, if these companies stay and grow and become bigger, what eventually happens is that people benefit, and what we're going to ensure is that we tax them adequately so that we can run the policies that we want to run. We don't think the situation is that we want to tax them like it is a complete tax and a complete break, right? It's a balancing act. We think that we'll lean towards a bias towards economic growth. We make sure that we tax them to a certain extent, but it's not as though we let them run free without taxing them, right? So what we argue is that they're unlikely to radicalize, because what we say is that people are going to be able to enjoy the dividends of growth anyway, right? Because we say that through economic growth and focusing on economic growth, what is likely to happen is that wages will rise and people will buy more things, right? To have more material goods on their hands. We think that's a good thing. Well, on the second level, they argue that these rich individuals will have political leverage, and what will happen is that they will control the political system with the money that they have. What we argue is that here, on the first level, what you do is that you reform the political system to make sure that campaign financing laws are not to the extent whereby the rich can influence them. But we think on the second level, the rich has no incentive whatsoever to bend the laws to such an extent that they would be oppressive. Because we must understand that corporations exist in society upon the goodwill of the people within society, right? So we think that when it comes to the extent where people are starving, we don't think the companies will want to do that or manipulate political scheme, the field to do that, because ultimately they suffer as well, because they can't get the kind of good workers that they want. They can't have the kind of like domestic market that they have, right? Because the more people are affluent, the more people buy their stuff. We think that's a good thing that what corporations want. So we think that corporations, in and of itself, want some form of balance as well. So why do we think that policies that seek to reduce income inequality worsen the problem? Now, the reality is that what they have proposed so far are policies that are good for the people, but not necessarily bridge the gap, right? We say that in order to bridge some income inequality gap, what we're going to do is going to have substantially high taxes on the rich in order to bring the rich down to the level that is acceptable and close enough to the poor, or have things like, for example, minimum wage laws to bring the bottom all the way up. This is the only way you can reduce the Gini coefficient. But we say that this is problematic because economics doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? There are other countries that have comparative labor laws and have competitive taxation policies. What this means is that if you look at the fact that businesses are highly mobile and it's very easy to uproot and set up somewhere else, what we say is that they're not likely to do is that they're going to go and find where is the most favorable taxation environment and business environment. What these laws do is that they raise the cost of operations. They make it harder, members of this house, to make as much money as they can, and they're likely to just go on to another country. And the poor are going to be hurt the most in this case, because the companies that leave are often the ones that are the biggest, right? The Coca-Colas, the Nikes, because they have the capital and the ability to move. These are the big companies, members of this house, and these are the companies that often hire the most people. And we say that the poor, given that they are most likely not being in labor-intensive industries, they are going to be hurt the most, because now they are the ones who are going to be retrenched when Coca-Cola uproots and move over to another country. Thank you. And we say that when these companies do leave, they cannot find jobs, right? Because they're not as educated, they're not as skilled. What is far worse than not being able to afford the Ferrari that the guy offers is the fact that now you don't even have a job to feed your family. I think that's far worse. On our side of society, economic growth is far more efficient, because if you want to have the kind of policies they want, like things like, for example, welfare policies, right? These are things that are funded pay as you go. What that means, members of the source, is that what you need revenue to sustain these programs. We don't think that the poor have or earn enough to sustain the programs on their own. This means that a lot of these funding for these programs come from taxation from the rich. The rich may earn a lot, yes. They may benefit a lot, and people drive Ferraris, but the reality is that they pay disproportionately more tax. They pay 20% on their income. Is substantially a lot more than what a poor person pays. What that means, members of this house, is that through taxation policies, we're able to fund these programs, the very programs that they care about, that help the bottom line. No, thank you. Particularly for the developing nations that they talk about, right? Because we say that if we're talking about these nations that are the poor, what's likely going to happen is that the ones who are the rich elites have the ability to just take a plane ticket, put their money in a Swiss bank account, and fly off to another nation. And these are the people they need, members of this house, because the Eduardo Severins of the world are the ones with the capital to invest in your state-owned corporations. The Eduardo Severins of the world are the people people who are able to fund startups the way that Eduardo Saverin came to Singapore and threw millions of dollars at Singapore startups and created jobs for people, members of this house. We think that's a good thing. Moreover, what we argue, members of this house, is that at the end of the day, what you want to do is that you want to make it easier for this virtuous growth to occur. Because when these companies when these companies grow because of the fact they're able to work more efficiently, at the end of the day, they hire more people. They pay the workers a lot more. What happens then, members of the house, is simple economics. What happens then is that locals have more money to spend, which means a bigger domestic economy, which means that smaller businesses, like the one that my father runs, a provincial shop, is able to have businesses as well. And we think that their policies hurt the small business owners, like my father, who is not able to make money or even dare to start a business, because now I will pay 40% on taxes, because now I'm a small business owner. But in the context of the economy, I'm a rich person. But the reality is that these small business owners are also the ones who create jobs for those who are poor, who hire the people who are uneducated to do stuff for the small business. We think that ultimately, when you have economic growth policies that encourage people to start businesses, these are things that are good because they benefit the corporations, the small businesses, they start more jobs, and I'm going to sound like Mitt Romney, but the reality is, members of this house, that is the way forward. At the end of the day, members of this house, we cannot be blinded by the fact that, you know what, by jealousy, by the fact that the guy can drive a Ferrari and I can't, that Andre Kwa can drive a Merc and I can't, that ultimately we want to ensure that we can, as a country, move on together, and I'm happy driving the Hyundai that I drive. Thank you.
Okay, thank that speaker for his speech. And now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Not many times, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to be a South Korean in debates because often motions don't really entail us. But at this time, I'm very proud to be a South Korean because we see the opposition side now believing in the success stories of South Korea, that we have miraculous Han River, that somehow we have overcome all the poverty and now we are kicking well in a globalized society, perhaps as the 13th exporter or 15th exporter, which again regimes constantly quote to provide us with proud that we don't believe in. We think that the opposition is wrong for all reasons because we have seen countries like the United States, we have seen countries like the Republic of Korea, who constantly told their citizens, if you take the minimum wage, and if you take the minimum wage, despite the fact that you cannot even buy a McDonald's burger, if you can wait, a good day will come for you. We already know that those were lies and only rhetoric. That's what we are proud to propose. Having said that, let's move on to the rebuttals before we move on to substantives. How, at the end of the day, governments have been employing mechanisms to make this into a downward spiral that only the rich can benefit from the system, and furthermore, why inherently this is undemocratic. But before their rebuttals, on the first level, they told us that growth trickles down. We see even one of the strongest countries on the earth, the United States, people dying because simply they cannot get medical health care. We see that it's even hard for countries like the United States, no thank you, despite the fact that their GDP per capita is perhaps $40,000, $45,000, anyhow, no thank you, we see them not even being able to have a proper settlements with national health care for a long time. But when the UK did it, because they did it when they were right after the Second World War, nonetheless they developed their economy because we on the side of the opening government believe that it's not necessarily always the case that we simply prioritize social services, they would try to provide basic welfare to the citizen. It doesn't mean that we don't have economy anyways. But on a second level, that's why we are saying that minorities will always exist on their side of the house. In other words, what we argue is, in developing states, it's even worse because we see active starvation and active level of hindrance in everyday life for these individuals because they continue to tell you it's perfectly fine that you work 14 hours a day and still don't have a proper life. No, thank you. But even in the developed world, the argument coming from opening government is this. We have relative poverty. In other words, you do barely live on. You do pay the rent, and at the end of the day, perhaps you have a cell phone where you can contact your friends. But that's the bare minimum that you go up. Because you take the minimum wage and you pay the entirety for your rent, you have no savings whatsoever because no one is necessarily telling you how to raise the minimum wage. It's a broil to make 201 higher, which is around $0.2 in the national parliament because we still believe in the rhetoric that if you wait, it will get better and we still need to increase the pie. No, thank you. In other words, this relative conception of poverty does not bring any benefit to society, as my Prime Minister already told you, which we heard no response whatsoever. No, thank you. But again, moving on to the second rebuttal, the end of the spiral is this: because you have set the economic structure as the opening opposition argues. In other words, you already saw that lowering the economic tax will necessarily lead to more investments and whatnot. The problem is, why not we not see the trickling down effect? This becomes the government's legitimacy, this becomes the governing party's legitimacy, and this becomes the industrialists to keep on arguing. On a face level, we are getting better and better, therefore we are again better. But again, we argue on an everyday life, we are not getting better at all. Because the economic structure itself is now translated into political capital, is now translated into, again, political support, and therefore at the end of the day, it becomes impossible to demand distribution even when time comes. No, thank you. On a third level, that's why they say, despite employment increases, we agree, it's not a good employment, because what Samsung employs people, they employ people giving the minimum wage, having lax regulations on labor firing, and all those do not necessarily make our people happy in any means. But on a fourth level, that's why we say small businesses are the ones that target it the most. No, thank you. Because small businesses believe that their lives are okay, while they spend most of their time basically paying the minimum life that they have to have. In other words, we think that it's better, even if as a result they take less dollars home, they get most of the social services by the government. They still get better education by the government, they still get better healthcare by the government. If that is true, even if your revenue is less, that is exactly your disposable income, and that is making your life better. We think that's a better role for small businesses also. Then let's move on to the substantive, but before that I'll take closing.
If they've demonstrated already as opposition leader that you could attain these in the long run, why can't we exchange these socialist services for economies of scale?
We have proven you that it doesn't happen in the long run with the examples that exist right now. But let's move on. Why this impediment further makes it harder? No, thank you. Because we think that in the status quo there are active mechanisms that these governments use. In other words, for instance, as governments continue to tell you that in an educative system that you should be better employees and you should be hard workers and nothing else. In other words, we often see the governments employing mechanisms in the educative field trying to argue that we need to have these better employees. Because at the end of the day, the thing is this: the governments that employ this tactic, their legitimacy largely comes from the fact that their GDP has been risen. In other words, it does not come from the fact that in any ways everyday lives are better, but they come from the fact that perhaps we became the 13th exporter in the world. That is one of the reasons why we see even the economic structure telling the average people that in the cases that you fail, in other words, in the cases where we actually observe, no thank you, individual failures, it's because you did not work hard, and it's because you are the failures of the society, not necessarily the system itself. In other words, because the governments need to justify their material thirst, and because they actually have to again collaborate with these businessmen who are only going for their pies whatsoever, we think that this active idea of comparison, no thank you, becomes embedded in everyday people's minds. In other words, what we argue is, this economic disparity that exists in the society is actively disguised by the governments that as individual failures and nothing else, because governments that employ the tactic of going for economics first need to further legitimize itself and need to further resettle the economic structure in the ways that they have to benefit from it. And that becomes an active propaganda that the government tells the people, and even educate the people from a young age, that is instilled in these ideas and individuals' mindset that we should only become these type of human beings. We don't think that is in any ways good. But furthermore, the reason this is undemocratic is this: we don't think philosophically the government ever has the right to permanently again determine that A region is more important over B. We don't think that they should determine that C person should receive more benefits than D. If any of such, again, zero-sum game were to occur, we believe that it should be in the case where long-term we should have a payback. In other words, the times where the government can require individual sacrifices or investment sacrifices, we think that it should be only the case where we can actually demand it in the future and have a sacrifice compensated in the future. But we don't see this in the status quo. In other words, we don't see that give and take has ever occurred. We don't see that despite the fact that laborers has been suffering, working for hours, we don't see it getting any ways better. But at the end of the day, we are having a mirage in a disguise that somehow we are getting better because the economy is getting better, because the government is getting better, and because the businesses are getting better. So what have you heard from the opening government? We tell you that businesses have become better, yes. We tell you that our economic, somehow statistics are getting better. Our GDPs are rising. But our happiness is in no ways getting better. Our lives are in no ways getting better. We are always perpetuated with comparisons. We are perpetuated with unhappiness. We are perpetuated with the idea that economic growth is the most important thing, and therefore you should fit yourself into that society, because that becomes my legitimacy and that becomes my reason for re-election. We disagree with that.
Okay, I thank that speaker for his speech. Now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
First thing we need to understand, Mr. Speaker, is that there is a very clear difference between welfare policies and policies that redistribute social inequality. The very clear consequence of the other side has to be that rich people get poorer, otherwise the ability to create social or reduce social inequality will never happen, precisely because of all the structures that they said will maintain at least the ability of the rich to remain rich. The consequence of this is that in opposition, we are very happy to admit that the rich in our situation will probably get richer. But that's not the point of this debate. The point of this debate is to ask ourselves whether individuals at the bottom get better lives, they get better kinds of lifestyles for their own benefit at the end of the day. And we're very happy to say that this will happen. Why? Because we don't think the adjudication of benefit or happiness is based on relativity. Even though I don't have Hyundai or I don't have a Merc, I'm very happy in my life. I'm very happy with the fact that I can afford being able to come here to debate this tournament. That doesn't make me any less happy just because other people have better things. Because that base standard of welfare, that base standard of being able to live is still accessible to me. And this is because I'm proud to say that our government and my government have decided to procure a policy of economic growth. Before I go on, yes.
Because you have a car. The problem is most of these individuals are near slavery, where they basically use most of their wages in their subsistence and do not have in any way to climb the ladder whatsoever.
Sure, let me get to that. But my only first response to that is I don't have a car. But I'm going to cover two substantives in my speech. First, why economic growth provides the essential abilities for social mobility, and second, why economic growth in itself ensures the best political and legislative outcomes for the poor. Before that, just a few points of rebuttal. The first, they themselves concede to some extent that economic growth is essential to everyone at the end of the day. But their response to this is to say two things. First, recessions will happen because people can't buy stuff because they don't have money. And second of all, unhappiness in general makes things worse for economies. Our response, and our standard that was not dealt with, is this. Before you can buy stuff, before you can be happy, you need a job and you need a certain amount of money. The thing we told you in this point is that the likelihood of economic growth is that you're going to give the probabilities you get more money, and I'll discuss this in just a moment. But at the very basis, we think this enables individuals to be in circumstances in which they're considerably better off already. And with the economic growth that ensures that big companies that hire the most people and employ the most individuals ensure that people get to keep their jobs and get to keep the amount of minimum spending they currently have to enable these economies to be better. In fact, what builds virtuous economies that enables everyone to move forward is the ability to create domestic industries, domestic markets based upon these primary and central actors that enables everyone to get richer and enables these economies to get better. Look at China. That is perhaps the best example of how a domestic economic growth-based economy enables sustainability for everyone. But let's get to the meat of what really this debate is about. Well, thank you. The second and more important question then becomes, how do you ensure that individuals on the ground get a bigger slice of the pie? But that's not what we're arguing. We're arguing that your slice of the pie gets bigger simply because your pie gets bigger. And in consequence, the next question that they want to posit to us is, how do we ensure, therefore, that people don't create structures that denies them of the ability to access a bigger wage if this pie gets bigger? Our response is this, that there's absolutely no incentive insofar as companies who hire workers and hire above society to restrict these workers from being able to access these things. And there are a few reasons why. First, if you're middle income, middle class, and you own shares, or you're part of a company that offers you shares for higher remuneration, this means you already have the ability to access and negotiate against these companies in a fairer and better means. But perhaps they're talking about the rest of society, like they don't own shares. To which we say, there's no incentive for them to keep monies away from them as well, from these individuals as well. Happier workers result in better economies and better productivity across these kinds of markets to begin with. So apart from entrenching more money for themselves, which I can't see why they would, because they're already making more money, which is corollary of what we're saying, we think these policies are a great way to enable better benefits for these individuals and a bigger size of pie at the end of the day. But the natural consequence, no thank you, is that the only result of this is that people don't move forward. In a circumstance where companies can't offer more and are forced to take cuts and are forced to take reductions to the kinds of wages they earn, that reduces the incentive for companies to treat these individuals better. Now, I'll cover why this is worse off in my substantive as well. Last of all, we think the fundamental reason why economic growth is fundamentally better is because it provides for social welfare and provides for abilities to create and bulwark yourself against shocks that invariably happen within the economy. This is important because the people who ultimately suffer at the end of the day are not the rich, and the people who ultimately benefit most from welfare policies that can get bigger through economic growth are the poor. Insofar as a big part of the biggest economies in the world, such as Singapore, were able to build reserves on the backs of strong economic growth, these are the kinds of things that enable shocks to be better withstood and better negotiated if and when they happen. Everything else will be rebutted in my perspective. First of all, why economic growth is essential for social mobility?
What?
No, thank you. The important thing we need to understand is that the only thing more tragic than inequality is for places to remain stagnant is not evolve. Because at the end of the day, these places, the people who will survive these tragic declines of economies are the rich. The people who will save in order to create a ball themselves against the ultimate assistance. But more than that, we think economic growth provides the essential rungs of a ladder that enable these individuals who are in the poorest society to move up that ladder. Why is this the case? I think the natural consequence of any form of social or economic growth is to diversify economies and to find different ways and means in which you're able to enable these economies to find different industries, niche industries to which they can grow. We think this is a great opportunity for the poorest society to enable themselves to change their social disposition and to change the place in which they find themselves in societies in the first place. Be it a boom in bubble tea industry, or be it a boom in software or software companies on internet or IT manufacturers and engineering. These are the exact places in which individuals who were or in their own disposition were able to create or find something or find a niche in themselves are able to capitalize on the kinds of corollary policies the governments enable to enact and to couple with the parallel their growth to enable them to gain a lot more in consequence. This is why we think economic growth is better as well. Not only does it sustain and create more jobs for individual people, it creates different industries and places in which people can be, one, employed, and second of all, to enable them themselves to maximize their talents and abilities at the end of the day. Second, why this creates policies of better political and legislative outcomes. Capitol Hill and parliaments will always remain the way they are. They will always be dominated by the rich and the highly educated people who command the structures in consequence. That is why it is lofty and perhaps ambitious at best to say that we will change all kinds of legislative structures just because we focus on policies that address social inequality. The consequence of which, or the only result of what happens in their policies, for people of the rich to feel attacked, for people of the rich to find policies and outcomes to enable their businesses to continue in the ways in which they're able, in the new climate that now focuses on social inequality and the people at the bottom. The reverse, we think, the best case scenario is these individuals think that social inequality is now solved and don't really spend the time in Parliament to represent these issues on the basis that now they've got better things to care for, or people behind them, or the families that they came from to protect as well. Mr. Speaker, it is nice and easy to say that people and poor people should be protected, but we mustn't lose focus on the kinds of angles that enable these people to benefit their lives and to better their lives at the end of the day. That is why we goals.
Okay, I thank that speaker for his speech, and now I'd like to welcome the first speaker from the closing government.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the city or state of New York, ladies and gentlemen, it takes 6 times the minimum wage for you to barely scrape by when individuals other than yourself in the upper echelons of society are able to get away with having all the riches that the economy offers. A bigger cake, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't mean you have the ability to access and capitalize on that cake. We think that the kind of financial independence to be able to not be on welfare, the ability for you to have social mobility and not depend on the state, ladies and gentlemen, depends on your ability to have control and flexibility over your own life. We think there is an exponential multiplying effect of when an individual is rich and how much he can capitalize on the recent growth of an economy, ladies and gentlemen. And we think there is an exponential disadvantage that an individual that is poor or low middle class, that he's unable to capitalize on that recent growth. And that is why we must oppose this. I'll have 3 points in extension for you, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'll tell you why there is an access barrier to social mobility in the model that they propose. I'll answer that in several questions. Secondly, I'll directly engage with Brian's substantive material in regards to policy stagnation, ladies and gentlemen. In regards to why I tell you, under their side of the house, you create a vindictive upper class that's out to get the lower class because all they can see is that welfare does not get people who are poor out of poverty, and the immediate solution that society seems to think is that taxation is always always the answer, ladies and gentlemen, and the rich feel that they are victimized. And lastly, I'll disprove this false dichotomy in this debate that apparently prioritizing social inequality does not lead to economic growth, ladies and gentlemen. We think when everybody prospers, we think everybody prospers, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go into my extensions and my rebuttals will be integrated, I'll take Darren.
Let's be a bit more grounded. One of the policies that you would be against is internal migration. You would be for is internal migration. If the limit on internal migration would prevent people from sprawling into urban areas and not having jobs, why is that not better for their protection?
I don't necessarily feel that we need to defend internal migration as a policy in every single context, ladies and gentlemen. We think a more objective way to measure this debate are things that generally everybody agrees on in a very radically capitalist society. Things like raising the minimum wage, just like how Obama has proposed recently in his address to in the White House, ladies and gentlemen. We think that may be too context sensitive. We think maybe like my last debate, a fiat rule maybe applies here. So, ladies and gentlemen, So, firstly, the access barrier to social mobility. Let's answer a few questions in this debate. Firstly, what do you need to capitalize on the growth of the economy, ladies and gentlemen? We think there are multiple access requirements when it comes to capitalizing on that particular growth, ladies and gentlemen. Opening government hinted at this when they told you we needed education. But you need the kind of social mobility when it comes to knowing whether or not you can send your child to school, whether or not you are able to know that you can travel to your work, ladies and gentlemen, and make that calculation of what kind of jobs you can get. The kind of savings that you may have may determine whether or not you can afford insurance or education for your grandchild later on, or even to some extent, even afford a home, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the kind of access requirements that you need. But why is this more pernicious today in these kind of growth? Because the kind of growth that they propose are the large conglomerates like Microsoft or Apple, ladies and gentlemen, that create jobs for high-skilled workers and the kind of upper-class access, high requirement access, ladies and gentlemen. That means the lower middle income families or the lower class families, ladies and gentlemen, who may not necessarily be able to go to Cornell or Claremont, ladies and gentlemen, may not be able to get the degrees that are necessary to capitalize on the kind of wealth that you want under that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. That means there is an access barrier to the kind of growth that occurs under the side of opposition, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, there is also ladies and gentlemen, that the next question is, do corporations really create the jobs that Brian wanted to talk about, that we wanted to under that side of the house? We think no. That's a complete and utter lie. The trickle-down effect has been disproved time and time again. Even in the times of the most lax economic regime of the United States of America, corporations were very willing to outsource their jobs to India and call centers later and not create jobs for local Americans, ladies and gentlemen. They were very willing to reduce the kind of pay as well as the welfare or the kind of insurance that you cover for workers' welfare because they want to cut costs. Or they were very willing to cut down on jobs and replace them with machinery, ladies and gentlemen, in any instance, to reduce the amount of overhead that you have to pay in any instance. Corporations always have the incentive to ensure they have less jobs in any instance and cut costs. They can come to us otherwise. But we think it's even more pernicious under that side because Brian assumes that people can negotiate apparently with your corporations and say that I want more welfare. But there's an extreme context you have to realize here. People are desperate. We're post an economic recession where even people are not supporting their unions and leaving work on strikes because they feel that they need to gain access into the market and they need to get out of welfare quick. That means they are less likely to negotiate and be able to negotiate with their corporations because corporations have a higher degree of leverage over their workers, ladies and gentlemen. This all means that workers have an extreme access barrier to the market and cannot capitalize on the market growth that you want. The only way that they can have leverage over corporations if they raise up the social eradicate the social inequality, like raising the minimum wage. We think that's extremely important in this debate. Sit down. Secondly, let's talk about the policy stagnations and regarding the vindictive upper class. Let's acknowledge this, ladies and gentlemen, that oftentimes welfare does not work. We think that welfare oftentimes keeps individuals afloat, but doesn't necessarily provide them the ability to go on living, ladies and gentlemen, or thrive or capitalize on the kind of growth that you want. What does, ladies and gentlemen, is the kind of microcredit schemes or even the ability for an individual to pay for an education, ladies and gentlemen, that allows him to capitalize on the market, as I said before. But what happens when welfare doesn't work? What's the most immediate resolution that people come to? It's when people say that hey, number one, the corporations are screwing us over, but number two, since corporations don't want to help out with the minimum wage, the most immediate solution is to tax the rich, ladies and gentlemen. And taxing the rich oftentimes creates a large amount of harm, because acknowledging the imbalance of political leverage that the rich and the poor have, oftentimes the rich control the political discourse. And when they control the political discourse and they are vindictive because they feel that they are victimized by the rising tax rates every single day, ladies and gentlemen, we think that's more often than not that you don't help the poor, you victimize them, and you empower the rich, ladies and gentlemen. Oftentimes you have to realize that if everyone thrives and people are able to build businesses, people are able to exercise growth, ladies and gentlemen, and capitalize on that growth, we'll have more diversity in the market. We have more people being able to innovate. We'll have more people being able to participate in the market. We think that thrives for all. We are very happy to stand for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, I thank that speaker for his speech. Now I'd like to welcome the first speaker from the closing opposition.
What you'll get differently from closing opposition is that we're going to tackle each point we're going to offer with a concrete, grounded policy that does not prioritize social inequality. We think that we must begin with a discussion of economies of scale. What we receive from government bench is this idea that we cannot accept these because ultimately they put people into cycles of poverty. Let's describe a sweatshop. Foxconn in China is an unfortunate place to work in, we agree. But the alternative to people working there, which they never discussed, was that they'd probably be unemployed, they'd probably have less of quality of life. We think that on those grounds, they never really gave an alternative that functions as well as the employment of individuals, other than saying we're going to print more money and spend more on welfare. That's not enough. Secondly, constructively, what we also say is there's the concept of intergenerational justice. Usually when you work at Foxconn, your children can go to school and you don't need to work in the field. That means that the second generation of individuals after those who work in the sweatshop usually have better jobs. That's why China pulled the most number of people out of poverty into the middle class in centuries. We think that that's a great thing. But thirdly, we also think that the good thing about export processing zones is that they take advantage and remove what we call in economics a labor surplus. What is a labor surplus? It's when there are too many people to employ, and employing them at the minimum baseline that a minimum wage gives you is one that makes sure you employ less individuals. This has sprung up debates about the standard of essentials, which means that maybe we should remove the minimum wage and give people the option to choose food or necessities. These might come, no thank you, at the expense of a fiction. The fiction that you are entitled just because you were born. We think that as individuals, we must earn things by merit, but I'm not going to go into that. It's a long debate. What we would say, though, Mr. Speaker, is this minimum set of essentials allows companies to do one thing, and that's to employ more people, to have more people on salaries and more people on savings. And this takes a longer time, but it's more sustainable than printing more money. How come? The next thing they say is that we want to make sure people are less envious, because at the end of the day, the rich don't deserve something that, they just were born into. We agree. But the other thing about enticing the rich is you end up having them not contribute to the economy. You end up having them leaving with capital flight. We think that, in terms of this debate, we must take care to keep capital in developing nations, especially when alternatives become, when your country becomes antagonistic, alternatives become a lot more lucrative. We think that these businesses need to be taken care of. No thank you. The response to this, coming from both opening and closing, was small businesses would have a harder time. As an entrepreneurship major, I'm telling you now, most small businesses will fail regardless of the policies we set forward. 97.5% of food industry offerings fail within their first year. Stricter laws may mean less failures and less people like me losing money to the economy. We think that that's a good thing. And that's something we must sacrifice, because the concession we're putting forward is maybe this is a little bit less liberal, maybe less people will get to practice, maybe more people will be employees instead of entrepreneurs. But that alternative is better if that means people don't lose their savings and we have less trade destruction that has tolls on people. Next, why is stimulus bad? Sit down. We think that, for a couple of reasons, stimulus and things that are populist, like spending, are bad and to the macroeconomic situations of a country. For example, it discourages international investment because at the expense of individuals gaining more in terms of health care and Obamacare, you get more debt. You have to borrow more from other nations and you inflate currencies. We think that that's terrible. But next, we also have to take into account investor confidence. Because in as much as you have the international economy, international investors, you also have local investors. Their money becomes ends up being worth less than it would when the government was a little bit more frugal with austerity. Here we're going to posit the analysis that maybe the decision not to give welfare is a good thing. And the example of this is Obamacare. Because what we learned just last month was Obamacare ended up costing us 2 million jobs. And that was the economy of scale I was POIing early in the debate. That these decisions come at the expense of economies of scale that could optimize our ability to provide that healthcare, to provide that health insurance and provide people with options. It might be painful to have people work for their dime to pay for their bills. But we think that that alternative is better than pushing us into debt and eventually putting us into a situation where we can't afford other more basic things like public education and like the police, which is the most important thing the government spends on. Pure. Good. Okay. Let's talk about land acquisition. Another thing, which you might like if you're not conservative, is that it's also a good thing economically that we take away land from farmers and we take away land from rich business owners. This is not populist in the sense that you're taking away property rights, but why is this important? Because of the concept of an asset bubble, for example, that if idle lands don't start working, even though you own the property rights to that, we need to intervene unless we get an economy that's less productive. Where was this done? In Singapore, they confiscated lands owned by Yemenis, Sayeds, and Sharifas, and in exchange, they used it for business districts and construction. We think that sometimes your right to exercise your freedoms comes second to the ability of the state to take care of the collective. How come? Because eventually, your property rights may interfere with the long run grasping of things. And this was what I was talking about when I said you would have suburban sprawls. When you have urban sprawl. So what does this mean? It means that people start thinking that moving into the city and moving into the inner city at that would get them bigger jobs and better jobs. We think that in this case, it is okay for us to remove your right to mobility, directly contesting myth, removing your right to social mobility, if that means we don't expose you to the harm of a fantasy. What is that fantasy? That moving, for example, into Manila from the farther provinces of the Philippines would get you a better and brighter future. Usually you end up a squatter, without a home, without property, and with less than when you left the farm. Here we're going to make the last piece of analysis from our member. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, this limits your horizon and limits your ability to achieve in your own life right now. But it protects you from bankruptcy. It protects you from a fantasy that's visceral. And it makes sure that you have the chance to save so that maybe your children would get rich. It might sound cold, but this is the more economically sustainable thing. Why is closing opposition winning this debate? It's because we're the only team that grounds each analysis we present into an actual policy that prioritizes economic growth over social inequality. It's been 3 years. I think it's time we finally won this debate.
Right, I'd like to welcome the government whip speaker.
The prioritization of economic development over social development has led to everyday people like you and I to be slaves to the capitalist class, without us noticing that we were slaves to the capitalist class. I will be the first one in this debate to represent the Malays from Singapore that are marginalized, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to bring some specific knowledge about how we do things in Timara and Malaysia. through affirmative action policies and social development policies. Based on two areas. I'm going to tell you why economic development won't help with social equality. Secondly, why social equality is a precursor to economic development, ladies and gentlemen, and then we'll deal with some of the stuff, random stuff that came from there. So why economic development won't help with social equality? This came out loud and clear in Mifzal's speech, and we didn't get much response from closing off. Mifzal told you that when corporations come in, it only helps individuals to a certain extent. i.e. individuals will have access to low-skilled laborers, but they won't have access to the high-skilled laborers, ladies and gentlemen, because they don't have the necessary education, they don't have the necessary capabilities in order to penetrate those things. Like, because these corporations outsource these things, because of advancements in technology, ladies and gentlemen, because it's an unfair bargaining, they don't have fair deals that they make to these people. They argue, ladies and gentlemen, that the market will solve itself, because obviously after a while then corporations will need the necessary expertise in order to have cheap labor, then the government will have a natural incentive to create education for the people, and therefore this will lead to better social development. We disagree. So, Francis Fukuyama might be right in the past that economic development may lead to social development. But in today's world, where with globalization, ladies and gentlemen, with a lot of immigration, we think corporations are more likely to take expertise from outside, ladies and gentlemen, coming in to work within these countries. We think corporations are more likely to invest in technology, ladies and gentlemen, to cut costs. We think that this doesn't help the people on the ground, and we don't think there is a link between corporations coming in and actually helping people on the ground. Alternatively, what we do is that we provide education, and we have to make it clear what are the social equality policies that we are supporting. Increasing in minimum wage, we'll have education rebates for lower middle income families, we'll have subsidies for the farmers, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have affirmative action for the Bumiputras, we'll have microcredit schemes for entrepreneurs. These are the things, ladies and gentlemen, that will create sustainable development within these countries, because now the people are not dependent on foreign companies coming in where they are capable of creating jobs on their own, ladies and gentlemen, and that is more sustainable for the future. We think that they never really came back to the argument on how economic development will actually lead to social development. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Small businesses run by upper middle class individuals are particularly important to create employment for local communities. Why do you want to make it harder for the Mifzals of the world to create businesses by raising costs and reducing the potential rewards? Because now I will pay more taxes when I do succeed.
Okay, I don't know how that's related to Mifzal, but this is how we respond to this. What they're basically saying is that actually working like in low-skilled labor or working in sweatshops is better off than the alternative. And they gave the example of China, ladies and gentlemen. We think that like the alternative is social policies. In China, if they don't have access to sweatshops or low-skilled labor, they don't have any other alternative, ladies and gentlemen, because the government is not prioritizing social equality, policies on social equality. We think that is the alternative, and we focus on that, people will have a safety net. But China is an example that falls under our side because it's a state capitalism, i.e. the state controls what happens within businesses, ladies and gentlemen. We think what is more that falls on their side is a free market economy like the United States, where the state cannot control what happens with the market and the behaviors of corporations. And this is where a lot of abuses happen, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that the China model actually helps our side better. Now let's look at this argument of brain drain, because they said that people will be apathetic towards the social development policies and they won't feel that they have opportunities within their own country. Therefore, they will leave the country and get work elsewhere. We can see that brain drain might happen in the short term, ladies and gentlemen, but we think we can benefit from brain gain in the future, i.e. when society as a whole when society as a whole benefits and economic development enhances, ladies and gentlemen, we think we can enact policies like return home policies to incentivize citizens that went outside to come back and work. And we think there will be a natural incentive for these people to come back, ladies and gentlemen, and work within these countries. But furthermore, we have to also recognize that people don't win, because policymakers are often vulnerable to state capture by corporations, ladies and gentlemen. Because when you look at developed countries, like if you look at the US, when the governments are relying on MNCs to create these kinds of jobs, they are less likely to want to piss off these corporations. They are less like when they get funding from these corporations, ladies and gentlemen, they are less likely to create policies that benefit the people. Policies that they create are often benefiting the corporations, and we think this is a harm that the people don't see in the end. But before I move on any further, closing.
If the alternative to underemployment is unemployment, why is it a good thing other than if your government is rich enough to spend on welfare?
No, obviously, yes, like if you don't have these corporations, right, people will be unemployed. But obviously there is a balance. We are prioritizing social development, but economic development will take place a bit slower. But the point that we're making is that when people have access to education, when people have access to healthcare, ladies and gentlemen, we think the kind of human capital that we create is more sustainable. I.e., when these corporations come in, people are ready to access this market rather than being stuck as in the lower skilled labor, ladies and gentlemen, without realizing and not having access to to more advanced jobs. But lastly, we want to say that the government must be a counterweight to the free market, because we have to recognize that economic development can happen within the free market itself. If the government focus on economic development, ladies and gentlemen, then there won't be any emphasis on social development. If the government position itself to focus on social development, we think economic development will take place on its own. And we think that is important, because this counterweight will mean that people will be able to have sustainable human capital that will be able to penetrate the corporations that you bring in through your economic development policies. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this debate, we have to recognize that we cannot put the cart in front of the horse. We have to make sure that everyone is ready to access markets. If not, some people will be marginalized, and you create instability because there is hatred between the 99% against the 1%, and that instability is bad for social development. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thank that speaker for his speech, and now I think we'll not wait any longer for the opposition.
Alright, so I'm going to be talking about two things to sum up this debate. First of all, I'm going to talk about what they compromise. And what I hope to show you there is how that's something that's fundamental to the fundamentals of how we grow our economies and improve our capabilities to give people not just services that are oriented towards reducing inequality, but services that are essential, such as public infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, schools, and health services. And at the same time, for my second issue, I'm going to talk about what we are compromising, and I'm going to reframe and situate what those things actually are. I'm going to show why they aren't essential, and I'm going to show why it isn't worth what they are compromising in the long run. So let's move on to the first issue. What do these people over here compromise? First of all, they're compromising the injection and distribution of capital and the redistribution of that towards people within the economy in general. What we are advocating for, first of all, is an environment which is more friendly towards business. What does this mean? In today's globalized international world, we're making it so that people with lots and lots of money from developed nations are going to want to go to your country because they can make more money there. And whatever money they are spending there is injected into your economy. The important thing to remember here is that the multiplier effect is a thing, and it is a thing in spite of the fact that it'll happen in spite of specialization and special job skills coming from elsewhere and being done abroad, because you're still doing base operations in that country, and at the same time it happens in spite of the fact that labor may be exploited to some extent at some times. Why do we think this is so? Because first of all, the amount of laborers you're going to have in your country now employed means that they're all going to have they're going to have more disposable income than they would have had in the past. They're going to have more disposable income than had they just been reliant on the government to get their bare minimum, which in many cases would be the full capability of the government in that scenario. When they're spending that money, it's going to go towards people who are going to like, hey, this lower class, which is like a large percentage of the population in these countries, can spend some marginal amount of money. That is incentive for more and more people in that country to start investing in businesses that will cater to the services of these people and cater to their needs. And it means that larger corporations from abroad will have to expand operations and make it so that they're hiring more of the middle managers and more of the country and local managers that will be spending in that economy larger amounts of money. These people will be grouping into communities which will demand services that middle-class people will be needing. And you're going to have more specialized services and more specialized opportunities given to these people that more and more people can fill in the roles of. So there's an indirect way that the economy and the opportunities in that economy will be growing as well. And that's what's very important to remember here. Before I move on to the second point of analysis here, opening.
Your economic fantasy land exists if there's a free competitive market where no one takes wages, no one sets the wages, everyone is full information. That did not occur anyways. That's why we had governments to regulate and control from time to time when markets fail.
No, it's not reliant on that. It's reliant on the fact that they're operating in your country at all and paying some people wages that they will eventually spend in your country, whether or not they are permanently living there, right? And even if not all of it goes back to your country, right? Because it's still more money than you would have had otherwise. The other important thing to remember here is that there's the ability, like what they're compromising, is the ability of your government to improve the government's services. Because even when the money is eventually going back to some law firm in London or something like that, the tax revenue of even just operating in that country in the first place, and the larger and larger your operations get, as I said earlier, due to the fact that you're employing people at all, means that you're going to have to be paying more and more taxes in that country merely for operating there. It also means that, merely for operating there, which means that your government has more money for to improve the quality of essential government services, which aren't necessarily oriented towards improving the equality situation, right? We're talking about, like, if you compare the homeless people in the USA versus some middle-class people from China before they had their massive economic boom, right? Even if you happen to be homeless in the USA, you're still going to have access to cheaper goods than these Chinese people would have had, because your economy will generally be stronger than it would have been, and people will have better economies of scale for which to provide you with cheaper goods. We think the access to that goods and services is something, to those goods and services will be something that will scale with the quality of your economy, even if you were at the bottom rung of that economy. It also means that you're going to have more money through that tax revenue to improve transportation infrastructure, for example, or just public services in general, which make it so that even when you're not getting direct help from that government, the government is in the most efficient way making it cheaper for you to get to your place of work and making it so that you have even more disposable income at hand. Before I move on, Ms. Dunn.
When you have a market of billions like United States of America or China, companies already have a natural incentive to not leave and capitalize on those markets. Can you tell us why states should position itself with radical capitalism instead of helping people cope in versus of these radical capitalist corporations?
No. Like, if you are making it so that your environment is less friendly to these people and making it so that every individual laborer will cost more, they will go to another country. That was something Darren laid out very, very clearly. But what are we compromising on our side? We're first of all compromising immediate opportunities. And Darren made it clear that this is something we are okay with. The debate is not about basic human rights. No one who advocates for just growing the economy in general is okay for letting people starve. No one is for letting people just die on the streets. The debate is about giving opportunities now at the cost of the capacity to do so later with more impact and no compromise, because it doesn't have to be a decision between one or the other anymore, because you have more money to go around. So we think that there's a difference between entitlements and basic needs. If you are alive, if you are making it so that you can eat every day through whatever minimum wages are already set, then we don't think that we necessarily have to raise the standards of living that people have right now to make it so that they can live more middle-class lives at the immediate moment. Because like making that so takes away the opportunities for them to get intergenerational justice by saving up and making it so that they're going to be investing in their children instead, who will eventually live in a better economy. This is what we stand for. This is why we oppose.